Our top story is from Iran. According to reports, over 450 protesters, including at least 60 children, have died so far since the nationwide protests erupted in Iran in the middle of September this year. The protests have steadily spread across different parts of the country. The protesters are demanding freedom and equality while asking for the death sentence for the oppressors. The protests have steadily spread across different parts of the country, Tehran, Tabriz, Ghazvin and Qom being some of the affected areas. One protester, named Mohsen Shekhari, has been hanged to death for allegedly stabbing a security guard. This was the first such execution after thousands of arrests over the unrest, drawing a chorus of Western condemnation. Mulavi Abdul Hamid, an outspoken Sunni cleric in the Shiite-ruled Islamic Republic, criticized the death sentence. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's niece, Farideh Murad Khani, who had criticized the regime and supported the ongoing protests against the Islamic Republic, has been in prison since last month. In fact, she has been sentenced to 3 years in prison. There are allegations of torture and sexual abuse of detained protesters. According to the medic reports, the women protesters were mostly shot in the face and their genitals. Muhammad Mehdi Karami, who was sentenced to death for the alleged murder of a pro-regime Basij member, shared his plight of severe physical and mental abuse by government agents. Karami further said his family, he told the family that regime agents sexually harassed him and threatened him with rape while touching his genitals. The regime has prepared a list of protesters who are in line for possible execution. Dozens could face execution in Iran because of these protests. 15 are on trial in the city of Karaj, including 3 17-year-old boys and a married couple. Iran has drawn intense flag internationally. Recently, the Australian government imposed sanctions on 13 individuals, including the morality police and the Basij resistance force. On the other hand, while attending a ceremony honouring security forces killed in the protests, Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi expressed his determination to identify and punish the perpetrators of the martyrdom of the security forces, as the regime puts it. According to reports, Iran government claims protesters are behind arson attacks on military bases. There are reports of fires in military barracks and bases of Basij paramilitary forces across Iran. For more on this story, we're now joined by Alex Greenberg from Israel. Alex is a political analyst. Thanks so much for speaking to WION. Now, the reports coming from Iran are extremely disturbing. For weeks now, the world has watched in horror what's happened, the brutal crackdown by the regime on those protesters. But it seems the nightmare is just getting worse and worse. Now you have people being executed, reports of detainees being subjected to torture, sexual abuse and harassment, women being shot in their faces and genitals. How bad is the situation on the ground? And do you believe the international community is just looking on like a mute spectator?
Hi, thank you for the invitation. Yes, the situation is really a nightmare, yet we can clearly see, based upon the leaked information from the documents that the hackers group Black Reward published a week ago, these documents testimony and witness that the supreme leader and the whole Iranian leadership they don't know how to tackle or put down the protest. It's true that it is terrible what we hear, but it is not new. The Islamic regime has always been a regime of torture and coercion since the inception in 1979. So the question is that I cannot, of course, it's a strategy, the execution of the prisoner that you mentioned. But it is interesting, if I may utter this word, so that it is only one person, because the regime is in a limbo. On the one hand, they cannot shoot millions of people. It's impossible. And we see that no their effort are of help. But on the other hand, they cannot do nothing, because if they do nothing or create a facade of a concession to the protest, it will be suicidal for themselves. So they are. It is true that international support cannot help the protest in Iran, not because the international community doesn't want, but in principle, you cannot support the internal protest in any other country if you don't want to enter in a war or in conflict with that country. It's simply impossible. But on the other hand, I really don't see how the regime will survive or will manage to put it down, because we see the protest keeps over its third month, and it doesn't calm down.
I understand the point that you're making about how this is a complex issue, and it would perhaps be extremely difficult for any other country to be seen as interfering in the internal affairs of Iran. Though, of course, we've seen Australia impose sanctions on certain individuals. Perhaps there is more that the international community can and needs to do. Hundreds of people have been killed in this very brutal crackdown by the security forces. And the Iranian president says he's going to double down on his efforts to bring these protesters to book. But let me ask you this. As you mentioned, this is the third straight month of protests that's shown no signs of dying down. Do you believe that this is perhaps the single biggest challenge that has ever been posed to the Iranian regime, or at least the biggest since 1979, since the fall of the Shah? Because now when you listen to what the protesters are saying on the streets, it's no longer just about the hijab. It's no longer just about women's rights either. They are saying the tyranny, the oppression must end, and this regime must go.
Yes, of course. First of all, I must correct myself. What I meant is not that the international community cannot help if it doesn't want to interfere in Iran's affairs, but simply physically, you cannot support a protest in a country without doing something physical. So this is impossible. And yes, it is the biggest challenge that the regime has ever faced since 79, because yes, you're right. The slogan of the protester is Zan Zindagi Azadi, woman, life and freedom. And of course, it's not only against the hijab. The hijab ijbari, the forced veil, is the least of the evils. There are much worse things. And yes, the requirement is that the regime must go. It's not yet another socioeconomic demand mixed with some political demands. Yes, it is against the tyranny. But exactly because of that, the regime also is aware that this is a struggle for its life and death. And but this time, I cannot prophesize what will happen. But surely we see that the regime doesn't know what to do, because we can see many testimonies of security officers of Basij and the RGC that they're tired, they don't know what to do, etc., etc.
All right. Perhaps the regime is at a loss here, facing as it does the biggest challenge that we have seen being posed to the Iranian regime in decades. But how is this going to pan out in the weeks ahead, of course, will be interesting to watch. This is a story that the international community continues to watch very, very closely. Alex Greenberg, thank you so much for speaking to WION.